Hey there, super motivated flight school students. Whether you just want to pass your next basic instrument flight or you want to get 5's on BIs, I got some knowledge I'm going to drop for you here. So, having instructed in the TH-57 Charlie for about a year and a half now, there's one discussion that I would love to have with every basic instrument flight student that would save a ton of heartache. So here I'm going to break it down for you, a couple common student errors, a couple trim techniques, and then some basic hacks to get you through basic instruments. So don't be the Blue Falcon, help out your buddy, share this with them, and impart this knowledge for the greater good of everybody else, okay? So 3 things. First of all, common student errors with scan breakdown and fixation, specifically with moving from the simulator to the aircraft, how some of that positive and negative learning is going to transfer and how you can do better. Second, trim technique, and then third, some basic BI hacks. So first of all, let's talk about positive and negative learning from the sim. So you just got back from the sim, you've read in the FTI how it talks about position, rate instruments, blah, 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 all that stuff. So what are we talking about here? Well, in the sim, what's super effective? My torque meter, is that position or rate instrument? Trick question, read your Naval Instrument Flight Manual, it's a performance instrument, it's not either of those. But anyhow, that torque meter, I use my attitude gyro and I use my turn needle ball in the sim, and that's going to get me pretty much on parameters, right? I do the same thing when I go to the sim. I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying that works. The simulator is a video game programmed to kind of mirror reality, right? So we get positive and negative learning from that. Positive learning, your scan gets moving fast. You quickly consume the information you get from the torque meter, translate that into collective movements. You quickly get your information from your attitude gyro, translate it into cyclic movements, and you turn needle ball with your pedals. But that fast scan, we do speed that up in the simulator. However, when we get to the aircraft, then it becomes much more imperative that we utilize the rate instruments the FTI tells us to use. That turn needle ball, that's still an important part of our scan. However, we have to move those collective movements over to the VSI, and we have to utilize the airspeed indicator for our cyclic movements. So we have that positive learning from the simulator, getting our scan sped up, quickly translating what we scan into cyclic and collective movements, as well as our pedals. However, the negative learning is the simulator probably taught us a little bit of over-dependence on our torque meter and our attitude gyro. When we get to the aircraft, we got to get those out of our scan, and we need to move our scan over to our airspeed, turn needle ball, and BSI, okay? So we get that positive learning, getting that scan sped up, but we also have the negative learning of needing to change our scan to the gauges that are actually going to be effective for our performance in the aircraft. So that's one of the common student errors. You're right, the FTI says 2 common student errors, fixation and trim techniques. So basically flying the aircraft, right? You can't see, you can't make the right inputs. So we already talked about some of these, getting our scan sped up and moving some of that positive training in the sim to the aircraft and negating some of that negative learning that we got out of the sim. Another thing, trim techniques. Your basic instrument flight syllabus in TH-57 Charlie only gives you 6 flights in BIs. That's 6 flights for the entirety of your career to learn how to perfect your scan and learn how to trim the aircraft. So you want to make the most of these 6 opportunities in one check ride, right? Or if you're super lucky, you might get to do a check ride a couple times, right? But we utilize these six opportunities to get our scan down, get our trim technique down. So we're going to work on that scan. Next thing we're going to work on is our trim technique. So we're going to use a power attitude trim. So what the fixed wing FTI talks to us about and also alludes to in chapter 3 of the helicopter flight FTI. But we're going to go ahead and depress the trim button, dislocate the cyclic to the new attitude that we want, and then release the trim button. So we're not going to machine gun the trim, rapidly depressing the trim button as we move the controls around, and we're not going to mash it, leaving the trim button depressed for an extended period of time, multiple movements, and then releasing it. So how do we actually take this in practice? One of the things I encourage most of my students to do is as we go out and you're flying straight and level or conducting a level speed change, every time the FTI says to make a momentary pause at the new airspeed, I suggest they go ahead and depress that trim button, hold the attitude where they want it to be, and release it. Repeat that cycle until the aircraft feels like it's in trim. And then chapter 3 is going to tell you that you can go ahead and release pressure. I say just barely take your hands off the controls and let you're still guarding the controls, your hands are still there, but you release the pressure off the controls and see if the aircraft stays in CTS for a good 5 seconds. If it does, That's a good trim technique. You want to be able to depress the trim button, displace the cyclic and collective to where you want, displace the pedals after light pressure on the pedals, displace the pedals to the trim position, release pressure on all those controls. And rule of thumb, I think if you can let it fly in CTS for about 5 seconds, that's going to be a good new trim position. If the aircraft isn't going to hold CTS for a few seconds at least, you probably still need to keep working on your trim technique. So keep pressing that trim button, displacing the controls, releasing the trim button again. So talked about some of the positive and negatives in the scan from the simulator to the aircraft. Talked a little bit about trim technique. Now we're going to talk about a couple hacks. So as you're moving into the aircraft, most of your constant altitude maneuvers, you're going to have this VSI at 0, and it's going to be a changing airspeed. So like your level speed change would be a constant altitude maneuver. So what we want to go ahead and do is get this VSI set to 0, and then as we start working our airspeed back with our cyclic, we're going to have to lead turn a little bit of collective out to keep that VSI at 0. If we start pulling the cyclic back to decrease our airspeed from 80 to 70 knots, and we don't do anything with the power, we're going to see that VSI start to climb. But anyhow, this is going to be the stable base of our movement. We want to create kind of a stable base to our pyramid and then build off of that. So a constant altitude maneuver, we want to keep this VSI centered at 0 while we go ahead and deviate our airspeed to where we need it to be. Now for a constant airspeed maneuver, pretty much always going to be 80 knots. We have a varying altitude for our vertical S1 and then later on for our Oscar patterns. So we want to go ahead and we want to make sure that for our constant airspeed maneuver, we keep that airspeed at 80. Every time we make a power change, we realize that for any kind of power increase, our nose is going to try to pitch back, so we might need to lead turn a little bit of forward cyclic, and conversely, for any kind of descent where we decrease the collective, our nose is going to tend to fall, so we may need to go ahead and proactively trim back our cyclic to maintain that 80 knot airspeed. So as we go into those maneuvers while you're chair flying, what you want to think about, is this going to be a constant altitude or a constant airspeed maneuver? And if so, which one of these parameters am I going to work to hold constant as the other one changes? And I'm going to work my trim to keep that in. So there's a little bit of a hack for your chair flying while you're thinking about, hey, how are these controls going to affect what I'm trying to do for this maneuver? Another one, for our constant rate turns, we want to go ahead and get our weightlifter math on our RMI. You'll see the RMI is not down here because it wasn't really pertinent to the first part of the discussion. However, every 45-degree heading, you want to have those memorized. That's going to help your CRM, and it's also going to help your scan speed up. We'll talk about that in a second. Similarly, for any kind of changing altitude maneuvers, we want to have every 125-foot altitude memorized off our altimeter. What's that going to do for us? So for CRM, first of all, think of CRM as like a leadership drill too. Whenever you're tasking somebody in the cockpit, you already need them to know, hey, what is it that I want this person to do, right? Have you ever had a boss that micromanaged you? You hate that. It's just, ugh. So the thing is, you want to be able to go ahead and give your co-pilot the specific task that they need. What that's going to do is it's going to free up a lot of your thinking power and also help them help you. So for example, if you say, hey sir, go ahead and call out my 15 seconds, every 15 seconds on the clock, I'll say, all right, good to go. And as soon as you begin your maneuver, hey sir, I'm going to be looking for 45 degrees and 125 feet. Call me ahead or behind. I'll say, Roger, I'll do that. I'm going to call 15 seconds. I'm looking, I'll call you ahead or behind. However, if you give me the wrong headings or the wrong altitudes, I'll call that out too. Second thing, let's say, hey, at 15 seconds, hey sir, I'm looking for 45 degrees and 125 feet. I say, hey, I'm not going to do that for you. What that helps you with, though, is you already know as soon as I say 15 seconds, you are immediately looking for 125 feet and 45 degrees. So it's not like you're looking down trying to figure out the triangle on the screw or any of this weird stuff where you could get your math confused in your head. You already know exactly what you're looking for. You look, you immediately know if you're ahead or behind, and you can immediately make the appropriate corrections with your turn and then also with your rate of climb or descent. So, for example, for the Oscar pattern or the vertical S1, either one, it's going to be a 500-foot climb, 500-foot descent. So if you're a little bit behind, you're not looking off 0, you're looking off 500, right? So if you're descending and you're a little high, you need to drop that rate of descent a little below 500 feet. However, if you're a little behind on your descent, you'll need that rate of descent a little above 500 feet. I say ballpark rule of thumb, about 100, 200 feet per minute on the other side is usually going to help you out. A lot of times people try to get super aggressive with their corrections. They're just a little bit behind on their descent and they'll drop way down to 1,000 feet per minute. No, most of the time, all you're going to need is a couple hundred feet plus or minus on that VSI. Another thing, I like to draw the analogy of throwing darts, right? So if you're looking for an altitude, constant altitude maneuver, let's say you're keeping it right on the 1,000, so your altimeter is facing straight up. You start to get off your parameters a little bit, just throw your VSI on the other side. You're not waiting till you get outside CTS. You don't want to wait till you get a whole 75-foot deviation. You just want to notice, let's say for your level speed change, for example, you're doing your level speed change right at 2,000 feet, and you see you start getting a little bit on the high side at 2,000 feet. Well, just make sure your VSI is at or below 0. Don't go ahead and make a huge correction. Just if you're above your altitude, don't let your VSI err on a climb side. Conversely, if you're below your altitude, don't let your VSI err on the low side. Make sure if you have any VSI deviation, it's at or above 0. And doing that bracketing is going to help you stay very close to your altitude, and you're never going to have to worry about a full 75-foot deviation, because every time you start to get a little bit off your altitude, you know that you're going to be erring on the correcting side on your VSI. It's just a little hack there. If we're always aiming for perfection and we're making sure that we fail in the right direction, you're never going to get the full 75 feet off that way. Next thing, we want to make sure that we have all this math on our altimeter and all the math on our RMI correct, so then as we're conducting our Oscar patterns, we're proactively looking for the next thing that we're trying to get to. So there's a few hacks. I hope those are helpful for you. One, we're going to make sure that our scan is correct, and we're going to make sure that we're speeding up our scan while we're in the sim, and then when we get to the aircraft, we're going to be replacing some of those position and performance instruments that may or may not have been effective in the sim with the correct rate instruments in the aircraft. Second, we're going to make sure that we're utilizing an appropriate trim technique, and then also practicing that trim technique on some of the more benign maneuvers, so that creates a stable platform going forward. And lastly, I gave you a few hacks and techniques about how to utilize that scan pattern and that good trim technique that you've been developing to pay dividends on your maneuvers. That's all I got for you. If you have any questions, anything else you want help with, feel free to leave a comment below or get me on Twitter, Instagram, direct message on either of those platforms, and I will be more than happy to get you pointed down the straight and narrow, and good luck as you progress towards getting your wings.